Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Carrie Atkins-Barris with the Cincinnati Art Museum. Thank you for joining us tonight for Impact Circles. I'd like to acknowledge the Shawnee and Miami land that I am broadcasting from tonight. This is a conversation program by the Cincinnati Art Museum, and it is inspired by the artwork of Hank Willis Thomas called Question Bridge. You can check out Question Bridge in our current exhibition, Hank Willis Thomas, All Things Being Equal, which is open to the public now, or at questionbridge.com. Tonight, we'll hear from two panelists on the subject of trauma and healing. At the end of tonight's discussion, we'll pose a question to you to discuss with a group of your choosing, forming your own impact circle. We'll also tell you how you can record and share your responses with us and have them included in the exhibition itself. We'll have an American Sign Language interpreter on the screen for the entirety of the panel discussion tonight. Feel free to type any questions in the chat window, and we'll have time to answer some of them at the end. Any comments or questions that contain hate speech or derogatory content will not be accepted. Now I'll turn things over to our moderator, Eileen Cooper-Reed.
Good evening. I'm really honored to be here to moderate these panels and to participate in the impact circles that the museum is encouraging. I've been to see the Hank Willis Thomas exhibit, and I think it's really quite moving. I wanted to get a sense of it so I would kind of know how to moderate this panel. It will help me to decide the tenor. And so tonight we begin with one of the themes of his work, trauma and healing. And to do that, we have two dynamic individuals that I know. One, a gift who lives here in Cincinnati, and the second, a talented friend from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Robin Wright and Michael O'Brien. So we're going to just spend a majority of our time in discussion with our panelists. So I'm going to give you a brief bio, but they have placed them, on screen for you, and you can also access them actually by Googling them, and you can access them on the website, on the museum website. And so Robin refers to herself as a seeker of deep transformation and change. She is currently a senior social equity specialist at Design Impact. A graduate of Kent State with a master's degree in public administration, Robin has dedicated both her work life and her personal life to racial equity and social change. Good evening, Robin. Michael O'Brien, on the other hand, defines himself as a social practice artist, a dreamer, and a thinker. Michael is certified in childhood trauma studies and is an urban innovation fellow at the Lindy Institute at Drexel University. Michael, it's good to see you again.
Oh, it's good to be here and good to hear your voice, Eileen, and see you.
Thank you both for being here. So we're going to jump right in and begin with our questions. So we all know what's going on right now and the kind of stressors and pressures that we're feeling just in everyday life, and how difficult it is to remain centered, and how traumatizing it is to see the things that are going on a daily basis. And so even though we're in the midst of trauma, we also have to pay attention to healing. And social connection is an important part of that healing process. And it's something that I think we're all struggling to maintain right now. So, Robin, what do you think we can do for each other to promote peace and solace in this chaotic time?
Yeah, thank you, Eileen. And I'm so glad to be here as well. I think that's an excellent question. It's a question that all of us have been asking ourselves for the entirety of the pandemic. When we're in the midst of a health crisis that necessitates physical distancing from one another, it's important to be creative in how we think about ways that we can connect together and what we can do for each other. And so one of the things that I'm learning in this process is that this time really calls for compassion and grace. with ourselves and with one another. And so there's things that we are used to relying on one another for, that because of the times that we're in, people are having to show up differently, right? People's capacities are shifting. And so in this time, I think it's important that we hold one another with grace and compassion. I also think that it's important for us to create space for vulnerability, right? Sometimes it's important to just be able to name what you're feeling if you're feeling lonely, and to have someone hear that, to hold that as sacred information, right? And so extending that openness to one another, to be able to be vulnerable and practicing that vulnerability ourselves. And then, you know, the last thing I'll say to this question is just, that is, I'm also learning that we have to be much more intentional about how we reach out to one another, right? And so the happenstance interactions we would have in a coffee shop, or, you know, even just going to a bank, right? Or on our way in and out of the office, or on our way to work, whether we're on the bus or wherever we are, right, in our days, we had all of these moments and interactions that in many ways gave us an opportunity to connect with other people. And we're having fewer of those interactions. And so we have to be much more intentional in reaching out to one another, extending out to one another, and actually inviting one another to be in relationship and community together.
Thank you. Thank you, Robin. So in addition though to the COVID and I'm glad you called it physical distancing, because I think calling it social distancing is a problem and a traumatizing use of words in itself. There's also the racial awakening and reckoning that's going on in this country, which added to the pandemic is it's hard to even think about the trauma that covers. Michael, can you kind of respond to the same question about how do we address this? How do we find peace and solace in the midst of all this trauma?
Yeah, sure. I think, you know, there's a couple of things to just build on Robin's answer, because I think her answer is absolutely right. One of the things that we need to consider is what's new about the moment for us, right? Like what is not business as usual, just in general context, right? I think so many of us have been gaslit around issues of racism and classism, et cetera, for so long that even in this moment we can go like, well, I guess maybe this is kind of normal. And I think just recognizing like actually a lot of this is absurd and not normal. And, you know, recognizing that what we were living through before, though we were accustomed to a lot of it, was still technically not normal, right? And so I think in this moment, when we recognize that a lot of it's not normal, with like a new exponential heightened awareness of that not normal or non-normality, then it's about, well, what might I need that's different now? How do I need to show up now? How can I show up for other people differently? But also, how do I need to show up for myself differently? And I think it's important to, in that context, you know, I'm a developmentalist. I don't run from it at all, which means that I really am hardcore into the science of human development and the science and mechanics of our humanity. And mainly because so much of the experience under our old normal was, you know, abhorrent dehumanization and thus normalizing dehumanization. That again, in this moment, it can be hard to be like, well, I mean, I guess they're not dehumanizing us any worse than they were before. And it's just like, no, this is also absurd. With that being said, I think it's important that we recognize that any human being develops in 4 categories or dimensions at the same time: the physical, the psychological, we could also call that the emotional. You develop in a social context and dimension, and you're also developing in what the academic literature calls the spiritual dimension, but it's not spiritual as in religious, it's spiritual as in terms of meaning making and sense making of the world, your place in it, accumulated experiences, and how you begin to learn to expect of the world and yourself, and a lot of expectation management. And so you should be doing something for yourself in each of those categories every day. Just one thing at least, right? What's one thing you can do for your physical health? What's one thing you can do for your emotional or psychological health? What's one thing you can do for your social health? And what's one thing you can do for your spiritual health each day? And if doing something in all four of those categories is overwhelming, start with two. I wouldn't say just one, I would say two. Start with two, because when you do one, you run the risk of always shaping your understanding of yourself and others as being one dimensional. And that's not being human. That's not humanity. That's not how the science and mechanics of our humanity works. So I'd say pick at least two and do one thing each day regularly. Do it every day until you can do another thing in that category or add in the third category, right? But build bit by bit over time and be dedicated to it. Make 15 minutes for it. If you got kids, do it before they wake up. Do it when they take a nap. Do it late at night. So you got to work it out how you can, but you should be doing something in that area. And then I think it's also good framing of how to think about what other people might be needing, what other families might be needing, what the teachers might be needing right now, what just anybody might be needing right now. I think that's a very simple way to address that, because again, racism dehumanizes us, classism dehumanizes us, and we gotta get back to our humanity.
So it almost sounds like you're talking about to help retain a kind of centeredness every day, because you get pulled off center by those things that you mentioned, some of the things that we mentioned, and all the trauma that is happening, and whether or not it happened before, and just seems to continue happening and be exposed, right? Be even more exposed. So in many ways, keeping centered is what I hear you talking about in terms of being able to make your way through.
Eileen, is it okay if I chime back in?
Surely.
Yeah, thank you. Because Mike, I really, really appreciate what you said. I think, what's really important, I just want to emphasize again the beginning piece about this. So in many ways, this isn't new, right? And as Mike was saying, sometimes it can make us start to, for those of us who have been aware and been awakened to these things, and this is just one more instance, it can be easy to shift into that normalizing it. I also think that too, it is another reminder of the importance of holding that space and grace for where we are on our journeys of awakening, right? I know as a Black woman, as a queer Black woman, it's very easy for me to fall into frustration about the newness of the awakening of others. And that makes it difficult to be in community in ways that are needed for us to transform at a community level, right? And to grow at a community level. And so oftentimes for me, there's a need to remind myself that we are each on our own places in our journey, right? And that for some of us, this is old news, this is generations old news, right? That we feel in our nervous systems, right? That has transferred over time. For others of us, this has been felt at that level, but we weren't consciously aware of it until this moment, right? And that can create some frustrations. And so again, I think it's just another reminder to hold one another with compassion and grace as we move toward rediscovering and reconnecting with our full humanity.
Yes, thank you for that. Thank you both for those thoughtful responses. So to move on, to be a little more specific even, we are constantly exposed to visuals that provoke, these days, that provoke a wide range of emotional responses, sometimes to the point of exhaustion, I might add. How can we process these images and regulate our responses to them? Michael, you want to?
Sure. Just really quickly, because Robin, I appreciate being on this with Robin, because you're thoughtful, Robin, and I like it. Robin mentioned vulnerability, and I do want to bring up that practicing vulnerability is so important, because for many of us, we can see vulnerability as being weak or weakness, and so we won't make space for things like processing. So crying can be weakness, particularly amongst boys and men of color, and not crying can be your sign that you are strong or resilient. And, you know, that could be farther from the truth sometimes, that actually not crying is a bit easier than embracing what has happened to you, and sitting with uncertainty, and sitting with the not knowing and the pain. So I think, you know, just the idea of practicing vulnerability for yourself and giving space for others to be vulnerable, if you are accustomed to that, is a real important thing. In the context of seeing images that that are traumatizing. I mean, like, I think, let's just be clear. There is, I don't like making global statements if I can't prove them to be true. So with conjecture, I don't know of another group that's overwhelmingly exposed to their mortality in real news clips and media clips as much as Black Americans are. And I think it's egregious. I think it's out of pocket. I think it's out of line. I refuse to watch them. I do not have to process Black death. That is not what I'm here to do. That's not what I'm called to do. I am here to deal with my own mortality. Every human being has to deal with the anonymity of life and death, or the issue of life and death, right? When thinking about the 4 categories of our humanity, or the 4 dimensions of how humans develop, right? The physical, the psychological or emotional, the social, and the spiritual, or the spiritual also being the space of meaning making. Again, 4 areas where you could be doing something for your well-being in each of those days, every day. It's also important to remember that if those are the areas that are part and parcel to human development, that means we can create safety in those 4 dimensions. We can also create harm in those 4 dimensions. And so I ask, what harms are Black people being subjected to regularly when our mortality is put into our face every day with real news media, video clips, audio, and watching a world have to respond to, and watching a world not have to really respond to it in the context of justice and in the context of equity and fairness. And so, you know, my thing is, we don't have to process it. We should not be processing death like that. We should be calling out news media channels and outlets that are profiting off of that type of sensationalized media, because it is up at all of our expenses. There's this story of a family finding out that someone in their family had been shot and murdered because the video had gone up first. That is absolutely out of line and egregious. I wish I remember which family that was. It was a national story, but it was out of pocket and out of line. And I think what we have to do as Black people, and people who actually believe that Black life, Black humanity, Black joy matters, Black culture matters, defend our right to live in a world where we do not have to see those images regularly. Organize for policy that makes it so that the sharing of images like that all willy-nilly, where someone's just scrolling down Facebook and has to be subjected to a moving picture that shows Black death before they could even press stop, like, that's out of line, in my opinion. And again, we don't have to, I don't think we should have to process that.
I hear you. I hear you loudly and clearly. Robin, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's definitely some things I would like to add. I really appreciate the depth of the meaning behind what Mike just shared, right? And I think as it pertains to you know, the consumption of Black death, right? Like, I think Mike in many ways is spot on. I think the activist in me is also acutely aware of the ways that the widespread depiction in media of these instances have mobilized people who previously were able to live in a space where they could pretend it wasn't happening. And so I think there's some tension there, right? For me personally, I don't consume that, right? I don't think it is necessary as a Black person in particular to consume Black death in order to want to work for Black Lives Mattering and for justice, right? And so I do think we have to take care of ourselves in that way. And so I have a little bit of tension. I don't have an answer, so that may not be that helpful, but I do have that tension there. The other thing that's coming up for me is this idea of emotional regulation, right? I've been sitting in that space quite a bit personally, and I think oftentimes we're so quick to want to move toward how we regulate, and in many ways that feels and it mirrors a lot of white supremacist ideology around perfectionism, right, and showing up the right way. It also calls attention for me to the ways that we police anger and pain that people express in these moments as well. And so I would invite people, before trying to regulate how you emotionally respond to these things, regardless of your racial identity, right? Is first to recognize that you're having a visceral response and allow that response to have some space. There's a psychologist, Dr. Tara Brock, who talks a lot about this practice of RAIN: recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. And I think that same type of practice can be applied in this context, right? We are so used to cutting ourselves out from our emotions and to only allowing them to show up in a certain way, because there's a right way to be angry, right? There's a right way to be sad. And when you don't fit that mold in our society, you're oftentimes penalized for doing so, right? And so allowing yourself to feel those visceral emotions, don't immediately cut them off, because those emotions is information for you. It's information for you that could catapult you to enter that space of social justice in a way that will be more difficult to do if you cut yourself off from the pain and the anger and the sadness that comes from watching these videos, from being awakened and reawakened for some of us to the realities of racial injustice. And so I think I would invite people to, if you're not used to it, right? And I think there's different audiences, right? For those of us who live in the space of social justice, and for those of us who are Black ourselves and have to firsthand experience that pain, our Indigenous, right? Our Latinx, other people who are at the hands of racial oppression in this country and world. You know, for us, it may be a need for us to monitor and manage our consumption in a way that guards our heart, because our brains can't distinguish physical threat from that emotional threat. We're having the same physiological response regardless. But for those of us who have the privilege of living in a false comfort, in a false imagined world of justice and equality, I would encourage those individuals to sit in their emotions and allow that to resonate within them, and to investigate it and ask themselves, what can I learn from this, and how can I utilize this to catapult me to action in a way that's positive and moves the needle of justice?
Thank you for that. So those are two somewhat different responses, great different responses, because there's more than one response to any question. And as an old African American woman, what I would say is it resonates with me to sit in what you're feeling, not to escape that. You know, at the same time, I do not want the news to normalize how I feel about something that happens. So seeing it over and over and over again normalizes it and actually desensitizes me to it, right? So I asked a group of young people one time how many had seen some violent movie, and almost all the Black students had, and almost none of the white students had. And I asked them the same thing about if somebody related to them had been hurt on the street in some fashion, and it was the same response. So recognizing that trauma and deciding how you're going to respond to it is different. Plus, we allow our children to be exposed to it, I think, in ever increasing ways. And we do need, it's one thing for an adult to respond to it. It's another thing and make those choices, the choices that we talk about making. It's another thing for children to have to experience it, and the degree to which you want to not have to have that happen, because that doesn't have to happen. It has to happen some depending on the conditions in which they live, but if you can them not have to do that, like you can make that choice, sometimes we'll want to make that for children as well, because I can't imagine what some of them are going through at this point.
Really quickly, I think Robin brought up a good point about the tension, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's a statement I live by as a facilitator and a young budding researcher, and that's two truths can exist in the same space at the same time, right? Multiple truths can exist in the same space at the same time, and it's learning how to sit in the intersection of those tensions and figure out, like, okay, well, what's the next right step or best step, or how many best steps are next? And Robin's absolutely right. While for me and many others, those images are traumatizing. I think for a lot of Black people, seeing that over and over again, no matter where you're at on the quote unquote woke spectrum or whatever people call that, like, it's still painful because that's your mortality you're watching, right?
Mhm.
But it has been really impactful in awakening a lot of white people or just non-Black people. And, it allows us to have conversations with them we might not have been able to have before. Like, why is it taking this many videos and media clips of death? Why do you have to hear people screaming out for their lives and watch and listen to the last 2 minutes of it for you to then go, oh, well, wait, maybe Black humans do matter. Maybe Black humans are humans. Maybe they should be afforded the right to breathe. I mean, like, we really have some fundamental questions that we have to sit in tension-wise and reason with why in 2020 we're having questions that arguably the quote unquote founding fathers supposedly figured out, right? Like, and what does it mean that you're just now waking up to that some almost 400 years later, right? Or whatever it is. Is it, well, 1619 isn't the founding fathers, but I think everybody gets my point.
That 400 years. Actually, it's 1526 when they.
No,
first
there
came.
it is.
But yes, that's all right. Thank you for that. No, this is it is important because it is it's also complicated, and you brought up uncertainty as well, and you didn't dwell on that, Michael. But so can you talk a little bit more about when you talked about the uncertainty of what's going to happen and how you dwell in that?
Yeah, so really quickly, I think the best way to answer that is to define trauma for a minute. There are a couple of really great definitions of trauma, and I would, I know we got a limited amount of time, but Robin's last answer had some really great nuggets in there that I really hope people go back and listen to and underscore around the emotions being a form of information. It is a way your body is communicating something to you, literally from a biological and survival perspective. That is absolutely true. And in the 21st century, there's another thing that she said about seeing something can be just as physiologically stimulating and activating for your body's stress mechanism as experiencing the thing itself. Also, thinking about it and imagining it can do the same thing. And so all that being said, when we think about trauma, there are a couple of definitions for trauma. There's two I want to share, but there are a bunch out there that are kind of quote unquote official definitions. One comes from the American Psychiatric Association. It says that a trauma involves a perceived or literal threat to one's physical or emotional well-being, and it brings out intense feelings of terror, helplessness, and a lack of control. I really love that definition because it gives you qualifiers, right? It gives you the fact that it's perceived or literal, which means you can't tell someone else what is traumatic in their life. You don't know their identity-based experiences. You don't know their culture, their history, the way they've learned to make sense of the world. So you can't say what's traumatic for that other person. But if you practice good active listening and you practice good relationship building with that individual, you can begin to hear in their storytelling when they felt powerless, helpless, terrified, and lack of control, because they'll be describing it even if they're not using those specific words. So I think all of that's really important, right? I think the other definition I'd like to submit here that's important, it comes from a gentleman named Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, and he wrote a book. It's a great book called The Body Keeps the Score. I always say if anybody wants to read one book on trauma, that one's a tour de force. You'll get a lot of good information on trauma, healing, the like biology of it. It's just the whole night. It's a really great book. And his definition of trauma is that you basically know you're having a traumatic experience when whatever is happening to you is overwhelming any internal or external abilities or resources that you have to cope with that moment.
Mm.
Right? And I that's to me so important, right? Because when something is that overwhelming and you can't regulate, it feels abnormal, except that is a normal response to things that are abnormal. You should not be living in states of terror and powerlessness and helplessness and uncertainty. The problem is we have to learn to sit in those tensions because of the nature of how we've constructed society, right? We believe in the idea that only two parents should be raising a child when the history of our species has said something different. And when those two parents have to work 8 hours and 20 hours and blah, 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 like what are you supposed to do in that context? So in sitting in uncertainty, part of how you do that is be connected.
Mm-hmm.
You got to have resources to cope. That is how you can sit with uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
So so I always say to people, what are the people, places, and things that you can connect to that can help you when you're overwhelmed and you cannot cope? Likewise, when you don't have access to people, what are the things and or places you can get to that can help you cope? And when you can't get to another place, what things do you have available to you to help you cope? And develop list of those things. In our field, we have stuff we talk about, safety plans, not to be confused with a safety plan for those who are unfortunately trapped in domestic violence situations. This safety plan is a little different. It allows you to think through and identify how you can help your body calm down in states where it's getting or moving through levels of alertness to terror to hypervigilance. And one of the ways that I get people to think about that is if you were in a meeting that you could not escape for any reason, you were just stuck there or you were going to lose your job and lose all your money. What are 3 things you could do sitting at that meeting that wouldn't call attention to you that could help you bring your heart rate down? That could help you not feel lightheaded or dizzy in that moment. That could help you not ask yourself 75 questions in the moment that might just keep pushing your anxiousness through the roof, right? What can you do to disrupt the moment that has you feeling out of control almost, or again, hyper anxious, you're hyper, vigilant and ready to just respond and scream? And what can you do to help yourself calm down? And really, when you start thinking about those things or do those things and activate that list, that can really help you sit in these moments of uncertainty and tension. Because if you feel uncomfortable, you're not going to want to stay there. Most people physiologically do not want to sit in moments that they can't get a handle on.
Flight, right? Flight. And we talked a little bit earlier about that, the social connection. I love the way that you went back to that as that being the important thing. Having said that, if you don't have those things, there are people, there are places, and there are things that you can use. And so to develop a repertoire of those is important. And I think you pointed out the importance of the possibilities of accessing those strategies. So let's turn a little bit more to the healing process for a moment. Since we're in the midst, since this is sponsored by the museum and we're talking about art, how if you know, how have museums played a role, if they have, in the communal healing process, or what ways do you think they might be able to play a role in the communal healing process? Either one of you. Robin, you want to try that one?
Sure. Firstly, just kudos again, Mike. Like, you're spot on.
Spot on.
Yeah, you're spot on. And so I definitely am really enjoying all of the things that you're contributing to this conversation. I think when in turning the tide toward art museums, I think Art museums have and can play a really integral role in communal healing. One of the things that immediately comes to mind is the power of telling stories, right? The power of telling stories and evoking both thought and emotion to those who are able to witness the story being told. And there's so many different ways to tell those stories, right? And art museums have a space for that storytelling. And that storytelling can be historical and it can also be a future vision, right? And I think that, you know, that fourth dimension that Mike was talking about in terms of the spiritual, and spiritual not just being not about religion, right? Spiritual meaning, how do you make sense of your sense of self, and how do you make sense of the world and your own experiences? How do you connect internally in that way? And I think when I think about the context of an art museum, you know, I think that is a space where sense making can happen. You know, I found in my own personal, so Mike has a academic background in this space, and for me, a lot of my experiences in entering in this space is very personal. It's my own trauma. It's being diagnosed with PTSD and having to find ways to move from I'm in a state of constant vigilance and terror and living my life that way toward I'm surviving, toward I'm moving towards thriving, right? And a greater sense of wholeness. And I've learned in my own personal journey of healing that so much of how I now experience the world is not just the experience itself, but how I have learned to understand similar types of experiences, right? Mapping on all of those things that have happened in the past. And that has helped me to then see this situation that I'm in now through a different lens. And so thinking about the role of art and storytelling and how it can help us to find new meaning in our own experiences, right? Find collective meaning in the experiences that are elevated in art, right? Elevated, whether it's sculpture, whether it's paintings, whatever form of art, whether it's the verbal forms of art, you know, having an opportunity to make new sense of this, of our own experiences and get greater meaning, and to have ourselves be intrigued to think about our own experiences through a new lens can be extremely restorative. I always say that, you know, for me, I've found that it doesn't even matter if the story is based in fact. If I can, you know, if I can find, I can make up a new story for how I want to see myself and see and experience the world around me, right? And that new story doesn't even have to be rooted in fact. It can be rooted in my idea of a higher self that I want to achieve. And it is just as transformative because, as Mike was saying, you know, even thinking about something evokes a response down to our bodies, right? Down to the core of who we are. And so imagining a new sense of self, imagining the world anew, the possibilities, the hope that can come from art, the healing that can come from having your story told and resonating with that, and from seeing a new possibility can be extremely powerful and restorative on so many levels. And so I definitely think that museums have historically and continue to play a vital role in that process of healing and restoration at the individual and the community level.
Thank you, Robin. That's a great answer. Thoughtful answer. Mike, I know that you're an artist as well. Do you want to add something to that?
I mean, I'll add something, but not because I have to. That was such a well-rounded, full response, Rob. We're both fans of each other at this point. That was such a great answer. And it really was all the things that I would have talked about. The only thing I will add here is that museums have an opportunity to have people see themselves if they would embrace that opportunity. So many people are silenced, minimized, diminished in the context of their experiences. It's interesting. So Robin's right. I have a bit of an academic background when it comes to trauma. And the fascinating part was, as I was studying and finding these tools and using these assessments on myself and my family, going, oh my God, these scores are through the roof. We went shit. Oh, excuse my language. I'm so sorry. That was an honest response. But that's literally what I said at 24, 25 and going to my professors, because I'm reading things like, if you have a certain score above this on this index, you're likely to be, die 20 years earlier, and Black people and minorities are subject to this. And now I'm freaking out at that moment, like, oh my God, now we're all going to die early too, because our scores are this bad. And, I had a really good teacher sit me down and talk me through probability and risk, but also talk me through the healing side, right? And that there's so much resilience also in these stories that these scores are not capturing. And it reminded me in that moment that the power of art is that it can amplify the stories that people push to the margins, that it keeps quiet. But in our society, everything's overly institutionalized. And so in some cases, if there isn't an apparatus or some kind of function or mechanical space or thing to help bring those stories out, they won't be there. Or people will forget them, yes. Or we're gaslit on them, right? Whether it's a story about affirming the truth of our experience, because there's nothing worse than having an experience and somebody literally affirming to you that that's not a real thing or it didn't happen, right? Because then you start to be like, well, I must be crazy. Something is wrong with me, right? And at that point, that's when you start processes of shame and guilt. And that then that's like putting tar on somebody's soul. Tar is hard to get off, right? And so I think museums have an opportunity to see themselves as providing an opportunity for communities to co-design the spaces and places and stories, and to excavate story, and to excavate culture, to find stories that have been forgotten and lost. And hold that up for people to see themselves in, to reflect on, to sit in tension with, and see what happens from there. You gotta leave space for emergence too.
Yes, yes. Thank you. You did have a little more to say than I thought initially. One last question I would, if we can. So Robin, you mentioned PTSD and having had it been diagnosed that, and what about communal PTSD? Does it exist? And if it does, how does it show up for you? How do you think it shows up? Either one of you, and probably both on this one.
The short answer is yes, in my opinion at least. Communal PTSD definitely exists. I think I see it manifesting on levels of community, right? So, my own experience, but then looking at my family experience and looking at families' experiences, right? And you can see the ways that, despite the fact that individuals each make sense of the same situations differently, that pain is present regardless of how it manifests, and I think there's also a lot of Black scholars, amazing Black scholars, who have detailed the ways that racism passes down generationally, right? And post-traumatic slave disorder, right? And things such as that. And so we know, like, there's so much research to support that communities experience PTSD. I see it now even in the advocacy space, just looking at the ways in which entire communities grieve, right? So as I remember the first major notable murder of a Black person that happened after having my son. The first time I grieved that type of death as a Black mom of a Black boy, right? And I remember that notable shift that I felt in that moment. And I just remember, and that for me was Trayvon Martin. And I remember the collective grief that, like, I felt like every Black mom in the whole world was grieving a collective grief for what had happened, right? Every Black father was grieving a collective grief, every Black person, right? And when you see those like communal manifestations of that grief and that loss, that is one of the manifestations of how we as communities can experience this trauma, you know. And the last thing I'll say is that I have come to see the racialization process, meaning the experience throughout our lives of having our identities and sense of self be racialized, to be that you are this race or that race or another race or ethnicity, and that means these things, and that comes with all of these qualifiers. That racialization process is, in my opinion, a form of continuous traumatic stress. That is a form of continuous traumatic stress that manifests in down to our physiological level, a spiritual level, right? Having your sense of self constantly disrupted, regardless of your own identity. You know, we talk a lot as Black people, for instance, we have internalized this notion of being 3/5 a person, right? We're always being having our whole worlds indoctrinated with this idea, from having to proclaim to the world that Black Lives Matter, something so simple, right? We actually have to say it because the world does not act as though that is true. In the same sense, white people are being racialized to believe that something about them makes them more than, right? That 2/5 more is also rooted in their sense of self. It disconnects them. To dehumanize someone else, you have to be disconnected with a core part of yourself. And that's traumatic, right? That is traumatic. And so that process of being told that who you are and what you know to be true about the humanity in someone else is not true, to be constantly told to dehumanize one another and ourselves, that's traumatic, you know. And I think we see the trauma of that in the disregard for Black lives, right? We see the trauma in that, in the disregard for Indigenous lives, right? We see the trauma in that, in the disregard for asylum seekers in the detention camps for their lives, right? The ability to disregard someone else's life, that is a manifestation of trauma. You have to have something about you disrupted and shifted in order to be able to do that and still go to sleep at night and feel like you're fine, right? In the same way that as people of color, as Black and brown folk, like, our sense of self is constantly being disrupted, right? And we're constantly having to resist this false notion that something about us is flawed and broken, you know. And we see the trauma of that come out in our anger, in our pain, right? In our crying out, in the level of self-medication that happens in disadvantaged communities and poor communities, in Black and brown communities, right? We are self-medicating our pains as we're trying to navigate the experience of being dehumanized so often. That is communal level. That's not just an individual. It's not a rogue person. And so I definitely believe that there is a such thing as communal PTSD, and that we are experiencing it on all levels of our lives. Physically, it's living in our bodies and our nervous system; spiritually, and our disconnection from ourselves and one another; psychologically and emotionally. Like, I see it in every realm.
Yeah. You want to put a period on that, Michael?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that's, I mean, no need to period. That was, again, super poignant and, like, just insightful.
Yeah.
All the things. I agree 100%. The only thing I'll add is that, you know, for those who might be, you know, academia is so fascinating because it's so full of itself. They think that if they name it, it's real, which is one of my favorite flaws of it. And then the other part is that if they didn't name it, it's not real. And it's just like, do you know how many things you haven't named that have a process and a thing that other folks have named that are just absolutely true? So I love that that Robin brought up post-traumatic slave syndrome, because Dr. Joy DeGrasse is a tour de force and is a brilliant woman. And I invite everyone to just go, if you don't want to read the book, just go watch one of them lectures on YouTube. It is engaging, it is entertaining, it is sobering, it is terrifying. I mean, it's all the things that she is a brilliant and phenomenal human being and a wonderful storyteller, but also can sit at the intersection of these tensions and draw the attention to those moments in such a clear and crisp way. You know, so I did just want to underscore that really quickly and underscore the fact that what we know to be true And this is why I do think there is such a thing as post-traumatic stress disorder at the community level. And I also want to highlight what Robin said about continuous stress disorder, because it's a term I've heard past couple of years being used in Philadelphia. And when I heard it, I said, that is a fascinating concept, because it's true. Post means that the thing is over and you're dealing with the aftermath. But what's it like when ecologically you're living through just varying forms, right? Ecologically meaning what's around you. You're living through varying forms of trauma, of powerlessness, of dehumanization, food insecurity and hunger, and schools that are literally treated like trash bins, right? Full of asbestos, full of lead, just craziness that you would never imagine a child or a parent having to make sense out of just to get through the day. And you're making $7.25 an hour. Just like the absurdity of all of that combined, to then think that so there's no post, it's continual, it's happening every day in the world of stress as a biological phenomenon. We would call that chronic stress or relentless stressors. We'd also call that toxic stress at that point, because when stress is chronic, it's toxic to the body. So when your stressors and your traumas are intersecting, because stressors are not always traumatic, but all trauma is inherently stressful. So when you're living through stressors and you're dealing with trauma on a regular basis, that is exponentially toxic to the body, to the brain. And you see it all in the health outcomes in neighborhoods that are living through this, confluence of factors, et cetera. And so one of the things that we know about the way systems work in the context of systems theory is that, to be really brief, as above, so below, and so below, as above. Mm-hmm. Like, that's not just, spiritual jargon. That is a literal thing in the context of systems, because humans, we forget that humans ideate, they think of systems, they create them, and then they power them. So by default, healthy humans would create healthy systems, and the reverse is true. Healthy systems would create healthy humans. But it's also true that when you have unhealth and dis-ease at the human individual level, a collection of human dis-ease and human lack of health is going to create a system that, there's a term, parallel process. It's going to mirror itself on the next concentric circle out ecologically, or that next dimension up. So if the people are suffering, the system is suffering. There's no way that those two are not intertwined. That's not the way humans work. That's not even the way just vegetative life works in terms of an ecological system. So whether or not the term is real, the phenomenology is real, right? The what happens to the people and the systems that they live in, and the relationship between the two, all of that is real. And again, you just got to look at larger data sets and say, well, what are the school systems like? What are they producing? How are the life trajectories in that region? Do people have access to grieving in the way that our culture has organized grieving? So what's it like for your neighborhood if 25 to 40% of the folks there can't afford a tombstone, and you're living in the context of gun violence that you didn't create? And that actually, as a phenomenon for Black people and Latinx folks, this is new. Gun violence wasn't this big issue 50 years ago. So we have to sit in the reality that those narratives around Black and Latinx folks, and even Indigenous folks, as being violent is a narrative that has been crafted for a very long time, and we've been branded a certain way so that we don't have to answer to, again, the phenomenology that has not been named, or these characteristics and attributes that have decades of data behind them that have not been named, and therefore can't be organized and categorized and given a label, because the closer it gets to being labeled, then you might have to do something with it. Mm-hmm. And they might not want to do that, right? The other problem is we also might want to step in and try to label it for ourselves, because if other folks label it and it gets problematized a certain way, they can stick money and insurance on all that stuff, and then it's just another avenue of profit off of Black pain, right? So there, again, all these tensions, all these truths are real there, but I think there's something on our backs in terms of an imperative to try to figure this out. And I go back to museums. What role could they play in settling in and holding space for these stories and these truths to become a part of our working world?
Listen, the two of you have knocked my socks off. You know, I hope they've knocked everybody's socks off who's been listening. I do want to reiterate the one piece about the 4 things to do, whether it's one or 2 or 3 or 4, I don't care, start somewhere so that you know that you are resilient. We are resilient people. We have to be, just to be putting one foot in front of another most days. But I really thank you for the points that you all have made, the ideas that you've put up, and I think the inspiration that you're going to give to these folks who are going to go off and continue talking about this issue of healing and trauma. So I'm going to thank you once again and knock it back over to Carrie so she can send the audience forth.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much to Mike and to Robin for their expertise and for sharing with us tonight. We have a little bit of follow-up work for our participants to do. I don't want to call it homework because that seems to have sort of a negative connotation, but some follow-up work to do. So we're going to ask a question and we want you to answer that question in your own circles. So let's see if I can get my PowerPoint to move for me. Here we go. We want you to ask this question to your own circles, whether that is your book club or your colleagues or your neighbors across the balcony. As long as you're keeping the COVID-19 precautions in mind, we're all for it. So our question for you to continue the conversation with is, how do we heal the wounds inflicted by racism, deepened over centuries, and revealed to more people in our country this summer? So we are asking you to continue the conversation within your own circle and respond back to us. The response can be kind of any kind of media you want to throw at us, a video, a written response, a text, screenshot, whatever you have, you can submit to us at the website that you should see on your screen, and we will integrate that response into the All Things Being Equal exhibition here at the Art Museum. So I've kind of given you your follow-up work. I want to say thank you to our awesome moderator, Eileen. She did a fabulous job, and I'm really honored to have her on our panels. She's going to moderate all 3 of the Impact Circle discussions that we have. So this is the first one. We have 2 more to go. The next one will be October 1st, and that will be political process. And then the 3rd and final panel discussion will be October 29th, and that will be envisioning. So I hope that you'll join us for the other Impact Circle discussions, and thank you so much again for being here tonight. Before I sign off, I also want to thank our IT support tonight. Ken, thank you. And our ASL interpreter. One last thank you goes to our Community Steering Committee. We convened as a community committee back in January to talk through Hank Willis Thomas and what kind of programs we wanted to put together in response. And so many of our program ideas, including this one, came out of those meetings, and we are very grateful for their work. So thank you to our Community Steering Committee meeting. And hopefully I will see you again October 1st, and we'll sign off. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. All right.
So Ken, let us know